looks like we are operational. Let's do our opening logo. Welcome to Evolution Hour. Once again from Seattle, a little bit early at 11 o'clock. But we've had a busy little strange weekend, and rather than being back in Spokane, we are still in Seattle for another day. Okie dokie. So, as you are well aware, we are plowing through the exciting world of Titans, the creationist book that doesn't tell you nearly as much as what you need to on a variety of paleontological matters. And the latest little bit is they pretty much accept marine predation, which of course blows to smithereens the traditional creationist position that was more common 30, 40 years ago in creationist circles, that predation only takes place. Oh, hello, Brian. That predation is only taking place post-flood. That is pretty much abandoned by almost everybody across the spectrum in young Earth creationism because it is completely untenable. So people in the Sarfati crowd at CMI, people in the AIG and ICR bunch have pretty much been okay with it, predation occurring after Adam sinned, and so quite early in the game, and therefore there's oodles of predation amongst the organisms that exist at the time of the flood. Anyway, they relate that to a 2020 paper from Jiang et al., which again, we'll be putting the links for this and the previous week on once we get back to Spokane to get all of our material in there. But like the other creationists, they shy away from the biogeography or systematics of the actual deposits involved. So the paper itself doesn't really go into that, but the taphonomy of the Jiahua deposit in China is actually quite interesting. And so I'll be putting up a 2008 paper and one from Benton in 2013, which is going to be some partial information, but it'll give a lot of the stuff that goes into the paleontology of the place. And there's fluctuating oxygen levels in the deposit and deeper sea volcanic conditions with turbidity flows, all of which bear upon the issue of how come the fossils are being preserved at all. And again, it's something that's not fitting in with that great big slosh detail, that as soon as you start looking at the little fiddly bit details of what gets preserved and what doesn't, it reflects sequential environments, not single big muck of the big slosh coming in. The part two to Answers in Genesis tweet from back in April on the 22nd from Ken Ham's bunch. And he was riffing off of a new paper, Ken Ham, Why Did Scientists Create Severely Deformed Mouse Embryo with 6 Legs? That I'll be putting the link up to. And that in turn relates to a Nature Communications paper on the TGFBR1 gene that is really quite a delightful thing, which is open access that they'll be going into all the little bits and pieces on. And Ham's stuff, as usual, is just thinking about it relating to the organism being severely deformed. So the idea that any modifications that you make to genes inevitably screw things up, whereas that's missing the point for what the paper's about, which is to see the dynamics of what that gene can do and the notion that Ham has that if tinkered with will create disabling, harmful, or fatal consequences. But again, this is actually very fundamental research, none of it being done by creationists. That's identifying the complexity of the system and what that does and doesn't mean, and recognizing challenges of how to go about doing that. Issues of which Answers in Genesis must know about. Oh, high order predation being discussed since it's likely that, well, oh yeah, well that's a whole different kettle of fish, because that whole network of Precambrian life in which multicellularity is taking place is something that doesn't fit well into any of the creationist time frame, because they basically have to have the whole life systems being innocuously bland during the initial creation week. So all the critters that are perceived as happening during the flood are there in the creation week. And they don't really go into an enormous amount of thinking about what's going on with eukaryotes in general and protozoa and all the other little elements of things. And they don't have to bother about so much of that because they're not being taken on the ark. So Noah and the family do not have to consider which branches of Loki bacteria they're thinking of bringing along on the flood scenario. Anyway, on this research that's going on, that what is actually involving is figuring out how this little gene interconnects with larger components, and they particularly bring it up in relation to mammals, where, quote, it could help explaining the absence of hind limbs in snakes, but their presence in most lizards as a counterpart of what's going on in reptilia and why mammals end up the way they do and all that sort of stuff. I'll also note the rather gratuitous insertion on Ham's part. There's a point down here of the unanswered question in the news article's title as to why the researchers even performed this experiment in the first place is answered at the end, and they put up a little quote. It's this little part right down at the bottom that I put my little notations in on, because they highlighted the quotation with potential implications in the evolution of the hind limb genital area of tetrapods. And they insert within a quote this link to an Answers in Genesis post on their generic complaints about evolution. So it's kind of trying to make a quite gratuitous manipulation of the material to drag the reader to their apologetics, even in the context of an actual quote. This thing, there were, towards the tail end, there's an awful lot of really neat stuff on here, on the expression of patterning genes, on this will be interesting to determine whether a mechanism related to the developmental plasticity uncovered by our work, including possible changes in cell affinity properties of prospective hind limb and genital primordia, could help explain the absence of hind limbs in snakes, but they're present in most lizards. They go on about similar mechanism could contribute to activity in the limb mesoderm. So they're trying to work out all the little bits and pieces of stuff. It's exceedingly unlikely that if we look at the creationist literature 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, that they'll be paying much attention to any of this stuff. There's a hit and run quality that occurs quite relentlessly in anti-evolution apologetics. You find them in a relatively small cadre of maybe half a dozen apologists who like to trawl the latest science literature, sometimes secondarily, sometimes occasionally actually linking to the original material. It varies within the context, but they're trawling secondary accounts often, and they're being very, very superficial. Whereas once they look at the little bits and pieces, they pay no attention to it whatsoever. There's no follow-up. There's no attempt to try to integrate that into their own particular framework, because it's all just hit and run. And this has been a phenomenon that's been going on for a very, very, very long time. That would relate to any technical issue that is brought up. I can't think offhand of any area where any anti-evolutionist is playing an enormously dynamic role. There are a few peripheral people. There's Scott Minnick on bacterial flagellum, for example. He's from the intelligent design perspective, not a non-scientific player, but nonetheless, it's relatively minor. But so many of the genetic fields in developmental biology, and of course in the paleontology field, it's really a peripheral material that pops up sometimes from the people in the Adventist movement. Loma Linda University, for example, there's some researchers that do stuff on that area, like the whales down in Peru that were excavated recently. But it's a tremendous scattershot, and although they can do perfectly fine and legitimate technical material within very narrow confines, it's always just a little blip here and a little blip here, not really integrating it with a larger framework, which you'd think they would be anxious to do if their model was in fact correct. So you don't really find too much going on. Ken Ham will just shoot off this material and move on. Whereas if you move over into like the ID and old Earth creationist framework, they don't even get as far as Ken Ham is in this area. As you know, of course, we're also going through, and next week will be another installment of the happy little world of the Casey Luskin 800 paper list. We're about coming up on like 10% of the material that we've gone through on that. And they're getting nowhere near anything that's relevant to making the point at issue on that. So that's our little commentary piece on that at the moment. There will be a bit more technical material. It's a relatively sparse chapter on the marine and pterosaur matters, given how enormous the group is. I also think that they're probably not thinking in terms of what the implications are for bats and why they're not showing up in the Mesozoic, or for that matter, what would deem to be Cambrian fossil record, because although modern genetics would suggest that perhaps the bat group came about in the late Cretaceous, even though the early fossils were getting about 10, 15 million years later. They're very little, tiny little critters to boot. Why they wouldn't be showing up in the flood deposits much more generically, because they would have been created during the creation week, just like anything else. Oh, hi, Barbara. Yes, I'm doing the show a little bit tad earlier. I've had a change of plans over here on our vacation, and so we ended up still here for one more night, and we'll be back into Spokane during the week, and at which point I'll get the full-length material from this and the previous week tucked in, because I do that on my home PC. So, and of course, we're seeing on the political front continuing screwball nominees coming out of the Trump administration, and it's going to be an interesting time as we slide on to where Mr. Trump becomes president again on January 20th, and then the shit will be hitting the fan in so many little areas that we can consider all flux in that matter. Anyway, on Sarfati and Tay's book, it'll be interesting to nail down precisely how much, if anything, new occurs when they finally get around to dealing with bird evolution and feather origins, because it's highly likely the vast majority of it will be stuff that is already part of their apologetics, and I think they're going to be heavily weighted for Alan Fiducia and some older brush material and all of that. That's going to be kind of funky to deal with, and see whether or not they try to play old cards in relation to digit formation and a lot of this other stuff. It's still remarkably sparse amount of source citation, roughly about a source and a half per page. It's only 100 some odd, wheezing on towards 200 sources for the whole bloody book, and the vast majority of it is just creationist apologetics. So it's a really weak tea stuff compared to, say, a Nathaniel Jensen, who at least tries to lob blobs of material, or for that matter, Rupin Sanford that we did is the first book in the series where they're slamming into a fairly good amount of technical material, misrepresenting half of it, but still at least giving it the old college try. Yes, greed is insanity and taking over. Yes, as a historian, I was particularly gobsmacked by the nincompoops that are probably going to be put in through Commerce and Treasury Department. They're just tariff groupies that think that the McKinley administration was the height of the economy in 1900. Apparently, they never saw Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. And they also seem to be oblivious to the fact that that high growth rate early 20th century also had unrestricted immigration. These are people who are not learning from history, but I'm afraid we're about to get a lesson. And I give them about a year before all the shit hits the fan as they start hitting the normal harvest times in the autumn, and they don't have the people to do it, and prices will be going through the roof, and tariff wars with our big trading partners in Mexico and Japan, or in Canada, let alone the Chinese, and we'll see whether or not Trump manages to pull off a depression with a high inflation rate, which is kind of taking the worst aspects of Herbert Hoover and Benjamin Harrison and weaving them together in a completely novel mess. So there's going to be an awful lot of hard lessons learned as we go on here. I think there's going to be a small core, the equivalent of full flat earthers, who are going to be impervious to any contrary evidence. It's like people in Georgia, which, by the way, the country Georgia, there's chunks in Georgia that are still Stalin groupies, but it's amazing the big public outpouring of support for Georgia and joining the European Union and disagreement with their kind of Putin puppet that's refusing to leave office. So all this flux, and then of course we've got the up in the air thing with Syria and Assad, who may be finally reaching the end of his shelf date. So they've never seen Ferris Bueller's or Trump's disastrous trade wars of the late 2010s. Yeah, the thing that I keep on wanting to remind people, and everybody in their own social media, and by the way, I'm moving a lot over into Blue Sky. There's been a increasing exodus out of Twitter, and I've been reconnecting my networks over on Blue Sky because most of the major posters are over in that network. But anyway, the big lesson that I keep on banging on is that source methods thing. I was just seeing Nate Silver going ballistic because President Biden decided to change his mind and pardon his son Hunter. And I'm going, he's all concerned about that. I'm going, good gravy. There's sheer insanity coming out of the impending Trump administration. And I could care less if he decided to pardon Hunter at all. I think because Trump is likely to be pardoning whole swaths of the January 6th people. I mean, there's going to just be pile up of material on that. So anyway, Silver was grumping that he wasn't going to vote for any Democrat in 2028 because of all of these betrayals. And I'm going, you get a grip, guy. This is absolute nonsense. So, hello, Purple. Yeah, it's going to be an extremely interesting time where we can separate the Tortukans from the non-Tortukans. But a common lesson that I would insist we need to pay more attention to, and the Republic really has got to have this as a baseline, is we've got to get people thinking in source methods terms. That we can't go on as a process of simply letting politicians spew their dogmatic positions without them having to commit to their data field and whether they know how to fact check them. Because we're going to be seeing a bunch of full-out Tortukan minds in the National Institute of Health. That Bacharach guy apparently going to be involved in things along with RFK Jr. and a bunch of nutball ideologues, the one that Kash Patel, that they want to be head of FBI. I mean, this is just a laundry list of full-out Tortukan ideologue nincompoops that are coming onto the field. And the documentation of that and the need for media at all levels to put politicians on a grinder to ascertain where they're getting their source material from, and to make it clear in uncertain terms that bad source methods lead to bad results. And we'll be able to measure that in a grisly way as we slam into the Trump economy and see exactly what all happens. And that the one kind of bright side that may come out of this dark period is that, generally speaking, progressive surges take place following depressions. And that took place after the 1893-97 depression, and likewise during the 1929 one that the Roosevelt administration moved us out of, and we really kicked up full speed during World War II. The issue as to whether or not other nations will be able to insulate themselves, and we want to avoid a worldwide depression because that's precisely the sort of thing that leads to world wars. That could be a mess. And the problem is that you won't have a leader in the presidency here who will be helpful in this regard. He's going to be an impediment. So there's going to be a whole bunch. There may even need to have kind of like a shadow diplomacy going on with various heads of state communicating with people in the United States other than the official representatives, because they can't deal with them or can't trust them. Certainly security information can't be shared if you've got Laura Boebert or somebody as head of intelligence services. These are people that are completely untrustworthy. Um, yeah, I still keep on Twitter just as an enablement thing, just to look at who's saying what about what. That Nate Silver thing came up on Twitter just today. I don't know that he's even on Blue Sky yet, but it's going to be an interesting little dynamic to see what's going on in an awful lot of people in the Trumpistas who are too young to ever have experienced a depression. And the economic dynamics in that, Trump in particular has no product line. He has real estate that caters to rich people and a brand, but he doesn't make anything. It's not like Henry Ford making automobiles or Rockefeller and the oil company that was still making money hand over fist even during the Depression, because it's an essential commodity. Trump doesn't fall into that category. Nothing he does is relevant in an actual economic circumstance, or is something that just caters to rich people. But the mere idea that everything that caters to rich people continues, I will submit the Duesenbergs and Pierce Arrows and all of that just disappeared during the Depression, even in spite of the fact that you still had some people with a ton of money. So it's going to be a very, very interesting dynamic to see what's going on in that, to see how particularly as so much of the policies are going to be spurring on an inflation spurt that will make the brief bliplet that occurred in the Biden administration seem like a casual walk in the park. And we'll see how these nincompoops from Trump on down deal with it. It's highly likely, if his previous administration is any indication, that assuming the ones who do actually get confirmed for the various cabinet posts, a big chunk of them won't be there in 2 years, let alone 4. There'll be this revolving door because, of course, Trump can never admit to ever being wrong on anything, and he will want to blame somebody else other than himself in this matter. But when you really start biting into your own support base and impoverishing people who voted for him under the impression that he was going to make inflation go away and the economy turn into a perfection, even though the inflation was down to 2.4%, and then institute a series of policies guaranteed to jack inflation up. I think it can easily start hitting 4% fairly quickly. And if he does anything nearly as stupid as what Nixon did during the 1970s, he could easily triple that inflation rate in no time flat. So it's going to be a really exciting time to be in play. And we're going to be seeing what businesses can't weather that transformation. I can see an awful lot of media companies, Netflix and others, places like Best Buy and that are kind of teetering on the edge. Many companies that have very tight profit margins that they can't really manage to squeak by. Or you have managers who are constantly trying to raise money, raise prices to handle profit margins. And they're shrinking base because of the Depression environment completely changing the dynamics of cash flow. So anyway, it's going to be a bumpy, interesting ride with some great novelties compared to previous Depressions. And we're going to see what's all going to happen. So yes, Elon, dear old Elon Musk is going to be an interesting character. He's apparently got some potential legal troubles over in England. That they're trying to subpoena him because, of course, their rules about free speech and libel laws and that are very, very different over there because they have a very different constitution than we do. We'll find out whether or not Musk, who is the richest man in the world now, whether he's going to still be the richest man in the world by the time all the dust settles. He could be the Samuel Insull of the period, where he was the guy that bought up, I think he was an American stock jobber type who for a brief period owned most all of the English electric industry, but slammed into fraud laws and various other things. And I think he ended up in prison on it. So it's a lot can happen in a few years when shit hits fan. Yes, no, first a Gibson, then a Fender. Yeah. Oh, the wacky thing about which reminds me of the fact that the guitar maker company has sued the Trump people for putting out that ridiculous $10,000 guitar thing that's actually pirating their design elements. And so, since when does Mr. Trump pay attention to things like copyright law? Yeah, right. But anyway, it would have been nice if we had we've gone so long, 80 some odd years, without a really serious economic collapse. And so there's whole generations have come and gone where they have no experience of things really going really, really wrong. And they think of a baseline of relatively decent economics, which by and large, the prosperity comes under Democrats, not Republicans. And then you have a bunch of people that kind of put rose-colored glasses on or bullshit lie about how beautiful everything was. But we've got to do some major course corrections on income inequality and changing tax laws and pulling things off, limits off Social Security tax and a whole bunch of things. And depression may end up being the motivator that really causes some fundamental change in this area of finally perhaps getting a full national health system. And in the end run, for example, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see SpaceX nationalized and incorporated into Space Force. There's all sorts of things that can happen, especially with the empowered presidency, because there will be a post-Trump presidency. That there will be an awful lot of power maneuvers that can be done that will be handed to them by the stupid Supreme Court. So that makes the 2030s and 2040s going to be a rather interesting time. So anyway, that kind of puts all of that up. We got a little half-hour thing in here. Let me put my dear patrons, who, again, I'm well aware of the fact that if the economy starts diving into the dumpster, there may be some of you who will not be able to continue to support the channel. I'll be sad, but nonetheless, I entirely am aware of the circumstances on things. We'll give it about a year before things really start getting messy. So next holiday season is likely to be a very different economic environment than the one we're seeing now, assuming, of course, Trump actually institutes all the claptrap that he's been pushing to do on day one. Anyway, thanks everybody, to our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends and the like. We will be continuing on all of our little projects. I would be pointing behind me to the various books up on the shelf if I were in my den. Jackson and I are continuing working on volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. I'm also working on the 3rd volume of Paralogs of Fog. I had a very productive time here during my working out little plot details and elements to make sure that the 3rd story is a rip-snorting little narrative. We want to keep all of that maneuvering as we go. So anyway, let me put up our little advert for The Rocks Were There, which we are uber proud of. And volume 2 will be just as flashily documented and in detail and up to date as volume 1 was. Okay, let's get our little share screen. Yeah, there we go. And there's certainly a fun bunch of works to write and research, document. Keeps my little mind vastly more entertained than trying to do Candy Crush. And we will be keeping up the work with the several books that Jackson and I have planned beyond the Rocks Were There cycle. And I have other works that I may be doing solo, plus all those Paralogs novels. We got lots and lots of stuff to deal with. Spread the work on the projects. If you can afford to get any of the volumes and donate to your local library, please do so. Let friends and that know about the works. These are delightful little, not quite little, they're bloody well big books that we're very, very proud of, and we try to keep ahead of the game. They're simultaneously beautifully documented and also funny because there's just an awful lot of humor, dark humor at times, to get out of just the wackaloonery that you see in people who believe things that aren't true. And this stuff directly connects up the pseudoscience element that's going to be a topic of a future book from Jackson and I on conspiracy thinking and anti-vaxxers and all of that stuff. that's all methods issues again. And he's been doing some scripts for various people on that element, and already has worked out kind of the chapter structure for that book. That's the one we'll be getting to after we're finished with Rocks. We're there. Only 50 feet away from each other over there. Anyway, oh yeah, this there's a weird circumstance of why people are thinking about stuff in terms of price thing. Oh, it's possible that Trump will simply announce that the low inflation rate, he's been successful on this, and just pretend otherwise. But you can't have the kinds of mix of bad economic policies, of high tariffs and high inflation rate. That's suspiciously like the Harrison administration back in the 1880s, and he managed to tank the economy in one term, leaving poor Grover Cleveland having a mess and producing the worst depression of the 19th century. So it's going to be a bumpy ride in there. So anyway, I'll let everybody go, and we'll be seeing me again here when we hit Christmas time in a few weeks. I'll be also visiting Seattle, but there will be some shows in the regular den for the first couple of weeks of December, and then we'll be into the exciting world of 2025. Oh my gosh, it's going to be fun. So everybody stay safe, hunker down, bear in mind the potential problems in the future, make sure things on debt load and other kinds of stuff are keeping things at a minimum so that you can weather whatever mess that we're about to have in here. And everybody stay safe. If you're in spots that are getting snowed in on the East Coast, be careful on things, and watch out for the wooden penguins. They're going